conflict unfolding in the Middle East is not just a war of soldiers and generals, but one of accountants and factory managers. It is a contest governed by a brutal and unforgiving arithmetic. The side that can sustain the economic and industrial costs will ultimately dictate the terms of peace regardless of battlefield victories. The numbers tell a story that military planners often prefer to ignore, a story where the outcome is decided long before the final shot is fired. This is not a war that will be won through tactical brilliance alone. It will be won or lost on spreadsheets and production lines. The cold, hard math has already drawn the battle lines. Here are the fundamental figures that define this new reality. Iran, according to intelligence estimates, possesses the industrial capacity to produce approximately 100 missiles each month, 100 advanced drones each month. In stark contrast, the United States, with its highly sophisticated but far more complex defense industrial base, can only manufacture and replace about 7 of its premier interceptors in the same time frame like the THAAD system. This is not a simple disparity. It is a strategic chasm. It creates a fundamental imbalance where one side's offensive output vastly outpaces the other's defensive replacement rate, setting the stage for a war of attrition that heavily favors the producer of cheap, numerous weapons. This production gap introduces a dynamic that is difficult to overcome with superior technology alone. While American air defense systems are undoubtedly the most advanced in the world, Israeli air defense systems are undoubtedly the most advanced in the world. Capable of neutralizing incoming threats with incredible precision, they are finite resources. Each interception expends a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment that is slow and costly to replace. Iran's strategy does not need to be sophisticated, it only needs to be voluminous. By launching swarms of low-cost drones and missiles, it forces its adversaries to deplete their precious and limited stockpiles of high-cost interceptors, turning a military confrontation into an economic bleed-out. A successful defense, where every incoming projectile is shot down, can still represent a strategic loss if the cost of that defense is unsustainable. Imagine a scenario where a country spends $1 billion to defend against an attack that cost its enemy only $10 million to launch. The defender won the tactical fight, but lost the economic one.
Hi, this is Rachel Israel with STEM News and Global World Report. We have breaking news that will have a huge impact on the global scene in the very near future. Let's take a look at what's going on around the world.
Repeat this scenario over weeks or months, and the defender, no matter how technologically superior, will find itself facing empty magazines and a strained treasury. The war becomes a race against an unforgiving clock, with the defender's own success accelerating its eventual exhaustion. The cold calculation is merciless. At the heart of this conflict lies a stark industrial imbalance. The focus is no longer solely on the battlefield, but on the factory floor. The United States and its allies build defense systems that are marvels of engineering, precise, fast, and incredibly effective. However, this sophistication comes at a price, not just in dollars but in time. According to Department of Defense procurement data, the U.S. is scheduled to receive only 25 to 37 THAAD interceptors in the entirety of fiscal year 2026. This translates to a replacement rate of roughly 3 to 6 high-end interceptors per month, a figure that is troublingly low when faced with an adversary capable of producing offensive weapons at a much faster pace. This slow production tempo is a feature, not a bug, of a peacetime defense industry geared toward quality over quantity. Building a single THAAD interceptor is a complex process involving specialized materials, highly skilled labor, and a long supply chain. Ramping up this production is not a matter of simply flipping a switch. It requires new investments, workforce training, and retooling factories, a process that can take years. In a sudden, high-intensity conflict, a nation fights with the arsenal it has, not the one it wishes it had. As one report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies grimly noted, the U.S. expended over a year's worth of THAAD interceptor production in just the initial days of the conflict. Iran's industrial strategy operates on a completely different philosophy. It prioritizes quantity and cost-effectiveness over exquisite technological refinement. Its missiles and drones may lack the advanced features of their Western counterparts, but they are effective enough to serve their purpose, to act as credible threats that must be intercepted. By focusing on simpler designs and leveraging a domestic manufacturing base, Iran can churn out hundreds of these weapons, This approach allows Tehran to build a massive inventory, ready to be deployed in overwhelming waves that are designed specifically to stress and deplete the more limited, high-tech defensive stockpiles of its adversaries. The war, therefore, becomes a race between Iran's missile factories and America's interceptor production lines. It is a competition that, under current conditions, the United States is mathematically set to lose in any prolonged engagement. Even if U.S. and Israeli air defenses achieve a near-perfect interception rate, the sheer volume of incoming threats will eventually exhaust their supply of interceptors. At that point, the defenders face a terrible choice: leave high-value targets unprotected or use less effective, shorter-range systems that allow more attacks to get through. The factory gap ensures that time is on Iran's side, turning each passing day into a victory for its strategy of economic and material attrition. Well, that's the harsh reality. Modern warfare has exposed a brutal economic equation that can be more decisive than any single battle. This is the principle of cost asymmetry, where a technologically superior force can be defeated economically by a weaker one. The conflict in the Middle East provides a textbook example. A relatively simple Iranian drone, costing perhaps as little as $20,000 to manufacture, can compel the United States or its allies to fire an interceptor missile that costs anywhere from $2 million to $15 million. Split screen: cheap drone versus expensive interceptor with price tags. This creates a staggering cost exchange ratio that can be as high as 150 to 1. For every dollar Iran spends on its attack, its target must spend up to $150 on defense. This disproportionate cost structure is the central pillar of Iran's strategy. The goal is not to inflict catastrophic physical damage, but to force a response that inflicts catastrophic financial damage on the defender. Each defensive launch is a small victory for the attacker's ledger. The conflict in Ukraine offered the world a preview of this dynamic, where expensive Western air defense systems were used to counter cheap Russian and Iranian-made drones. The war against Iran is demonstrating this on a much larger and more perilous scale, where the economic exhaustion of the defender is the primary objective. A recent analysis from CSIS estimated that the first 100 hours of what was codenamed Operation Epic Fury cost the United States an astounding $3.7 billion. The vast majority of this expenditure, around $3.5 billion, was unbudgeted, forcing military planners to divert funds from other critical areas or request emergency appropriations that carry significant political costs. Over the 4 weeks that some officials, including former President Trump, initially predicted for the conflict, the math dictates that such a campaign would quickly become one of the most expensive military operations in modern history. This economic bleeding has profound strategic implications. A nation facing such a severe cost disadvantage must constantly reevaluate its commitment to the conflict. Political leaders must justify to their populations why billions are being spent to shoot down cheap drones when there are pressing needs at home. The military, in turn, faces the grim prospect of rationing its most effective defensive assets, knowing that each one fired is another step closer to vulnerability. This creates a powerful incentive to de-escalate or withdraw, not because of military defeat, but because the price of victory has become too high to pay. The attacker wins by making the defender bankrupt itself. And that, sadly, is the calculus in play. The mathematical trap of this war extends far beyond the balance sheets of the United States. The most immediate and vulnerable victims are the Gulf states: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait. These nations sit on the geographical front line, hosting U.S. military bases. Tehran has warned any country facilitating attacks will face consequences. Missile and drone strikes are already targeting these nations. Gleaming cities and infrastructure are turning into strategic liabilities. The Gulf economic model depends on stability. They invested trillions to become hubs for finance, trade, and tourism. Their economies depend on the free, safe movement of goods and people. Closure of the Strait of Hormuz would be an economic cataclysm. Reports from Iranian state-affiliated media suggesting such a closure have already shaken markets. For these states, the cost of defense is existential. They've bought advanced American air defense systems, but the cost-exchange ratio is unsustainable. Interceptors are expensive and finite. Each incoming missile forces them to expend a precious interceptor. The economic damage is twofold: direct military spending and indirect losses, plunging investment, collapsing tourism, soaring shipping insurance. The war forces them into a defensive crouch, bleeding national treasuries. This vulnerability creates deep strategic dilemmas with the U.S. security umbrella. It may push them to reassess alliances and seek more independent diplomatic paths. The math pressures Gulf states to de-escalate with Iran, which could inadvertently weaken the U.S. alliance structure in the Gulf. The escalating costs and regional instability of the conflict create tremors. They reach far beyond the Middle East into the very foundations of the global financial system. For decades, the world has operated on the petrodollar system, where oil is priced and traded in U.S. dollars. The system generates a constant global demand for dollars. It cements America's role as the world's primary reserve currency. It grants the U.S. immense economic and political leverage. The stability of the Gulf, home to the world's largest oil producers, has been the bedrock. A protracted war with Iran puts that entire structure at risk. The immediate threat comes from the disruption of oil supplies. An attack that successfully damages a major Saudi oil facility, or the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, would send oil prices soaring. That would hurt consumers worldwide and create a deeper systemic problem. Nations heavily dependent on imported oil would face immense economic pressure and might begin to seek alternative arrangements for energy trade that bypass the U.S. dollar. This is not hypothetical. Major powers like China have already tested oil contracts priced in the yuan. A Gulf crisis would accelerate that trend. This shift away from the dollar would have profound consequences for the United States. The global demand for dollars allows the U.S. to run large trade deficits and to borrow money at lower interest rates. It underpins America's ability to fund its massive military budget and to project power globally. If exporters and importers shift transactions to other currencies, demand for the dollar would fall. That would weaken the dollar, increase borrowing costs for the U.S. government, and diminish America's ability to use financial sanctions as a tool of foreign policy. The war's economic fallout could undermine the very financial power enabling such an operation. The conflict thus transforms from a regional military dispute into a high-stakes battle over the future of the global economic order. Iran, by creating sustained instability in the Gulf, indirectly attacks the petrodollar system. It forces America's allies and partners to question the arrangement and to look for alternatives. The longer and more expensive the conflict, the greater the incentive to diversify away from the dollar. The war's true cost may not be measured in interceptor budgets, but in the slow erosion of the financial architecture that defined American power for half a century. In the face of a protracted and economically draining conflict, the allure of a single, decisive blow becomes almost irresistible. Political and military leaders may be tempted by the idea of a decapitation strike, an attack designed to eliminate the enemy's senior leadership. The assassination of a figurehead like Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, as reported in the early days of the conflict, might seem like a turning point. The logic is simple: remove the head, and the body will wither. This belief in a quick, surgical solution is a dangerous illusion. It fundamentally misunderstands the nature of modern states and ideological movements. Iran is not merely a collection of individuals. It is a complex system with deep institutional and ideological roots. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the military, the clerical establishment. The death of a single leader, even one as powerful as the supreme leader, does not dismantle this structure. Instead, it is more likely to trigger a predetermined succession process, potentially empowering hardliners who will seek to avenge the loss and intensify the conflict. The war's brutal math, missile production, the cost asymmetry, continues to operate regardless of who is in charge. The factories do not stop because a leader has fallen. History is filled with examples where the assassination of a leader failed to end a conflict, and in many cases made it worse. Such actions often rally a population around a new, more radical leadership, transforming a political dispute into a national crusade for vengeance. The initial shock and disbelief following a leader's death can quickly morph into a hardened resolve. Instead of collapsing, the targeted regime may find a renewed sense of purpose and legitimacy in its struggle against an external aggressor. A decapitation strike is a gamble that risks turning a manageable crisis into an intractable generational war fueled by martyrdom and national pride. Furthermore, the idea that a single strike can end the war ignores the core strategic problem: the economic unsustainability of the defensive campaign. Even if a new Iranian leadership were more moderate, the underlying military-industrial dynamics would remain. Thousands of missiles drones already produced, the factories capable of producing more would still be operational. The strategic logic of bleeding the US and its allies economically would still be compelling. A decisive victory cannot be achieved by a single act of violence when the war is being fought on the terrain of industrial capacity and economic endurance. The math, in the end, is more powerful than any one man. The final outcome of this conflict will likely be written not in headlines about heroic battles, but in the dry, unforgiving language of economic reality. The numbers point toward an inescapable conclusion: a strategy based on using high-cost, limited-supply interceptors to counter low-cost, mass-produced weapons is doomed to fail over the long term. This is the Iran trap. The United States and its allies are drawn into a conflict where their greatest strength, technological superiority, becomes a crippling economic vulnerability. The longer the war continues, the more the mathematical advantage shifts to Iran, pushing the US toward strategic exhaustion. The first and most direct consequence will be a severe strain on military readiness and national budgets. As stockpiles of advanced interceptors are depleted, it will take years and tens of billions of dollars to replenish them, leaving the US and its allies more vulnerable to other threats around the globe. The immense, unbudgeted costs of the war will force painful trade-offs, pitting defense spending against domestic priorities and creating political friction at home. Leaders will be forced to ask whether the strategic objective of crippling Iran is worth the price of bankrupting their own defense posture for a decade to come. This economic pressure will inevitably force a strategic reassessment. The exorbitant cost of protecting allies in the Gulf may lead Washington to reduce its military footprint in the region. A gradual disengagement, driven by fiscal necessity, would fundamentally alter the security architecture of the Middle East. Gulf states, realizing they can no longer depend on an absolute U.S. security guarantee, will be compelled to pursue their own diplomatic arrangements with Iran, leading to a new regional balance of power that is less favorable to American interests. The war, started to contain Iran, may paradoxically end up enhancing its regional influence as the U.S. is forced to pull back. Ultimately, the Iran trap highlights a profound shift in the nature of global power. It demonstrates that a determined middle power can successfully challenge a superpower by exploiting economic and industrial asymmetries. The conflict serves as a stark warning that military might can no longer be measured by the sophistication of its weapons alone, but by the sustainability of their use. The inescapable logic of economic exhaustion suggests that the war will end, not with a triumphant parade, but with a quiet, calculated withdrawal. It will be a peace dictated not by generals, but by accountants.
Can Iran really be winning the war against the USA and Israel? I'm going to try and figure out if it's true. Iran's situation often seems precarious, sandwiched between the ambitions of global powers and its own revolutionary zeal. Yet, there's a narrative emerging that challenges the conventional view of Iran as a perennial underdog. This narrative suggests that Iran might actually be achieving strategic victories without firing a single shot. The common perception of Iran is that of a weaker player, often beleaguered by sanctions and international pressure. But what if this perception is misleading? What if Iran is employing strategies that are not only unconventional but also remarkably effective? Strategies that don't necessarily involve direct military confrontation but are no less impactful. Iran's approach to geopolitics is multifaceted. It involves supporting proxy forces in strategic locations, a tactic that allows it to exert influence without being directly on the front lines. For example, its support for Hezbollah in Lebanon and various militia groups in Iraq and Syria has allowed Iran to project power in these regions. Cyber warfare is another area where Iran has made significant strides. It has been implicated in several high-profile cyber attacks against both American and Israeli targets. These attacks not only disrupt operations but also serve as a deterrent, showcasing Iran's capability to hit back in the digital realm. Economically, Iran has been maneuvering to secure its position, particularly through its relationships with neighboring countries and its role in regional organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. By diversifying its trade and securing strategic partnerships, Iran aims to mitigate the impact of sanctions. Diplomatically, Iran has been making calculated moves to improve its standing on the world stage. Its recent overtures to countries in the Middle East and beyond are part of a broader strategy to build alliances and reduce isolation. A key example of Iran's strategic success can be seen in its influence across the Middle East. The complex network of alliances and proxy relationships it has fostered means that it exerts considerable control over the political and military landscape in several critical countries. In Syria, for instance, Iran's support for the Assad regime has been pivotal. This not only secures a vital ally on Israel's border but also serves as a demonstration of Iran's capability to project power. The implications of these strategies are profound.
Well, that's the news for tonight. Thank you so much for continually supporting our content. If you did enjoy this video, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, and share this with your friends and family. I'm sure they would find it interesting as well. We're very excited to continue this journey with you. We thank you all for bringing certain stories to our attention, and for continually keeping us updated with certain events around the world.
Coloring Book for Kids, Volume 2. Available August 15, 2025 on Amazon. The Bible Lions Coloring Book for Children. Color 30 fun designs of inspirational verses and Christian artwork. A beautiful children's coloring book designed to fill your child's mind with the positive words of God's love. The Bible Lions Coloring Book for Kids was designed to be a fun, yet effective way to help children calm their tension. Hand-lettered quotes and adorable hand-designed illustrations will inspire your child as they reflect on God's promises.